is Greta Hunold. I'm one of the producers of Steppenwolf's Lookout series. How many of you all are having your first experience in this theater? Awesome. So Lookout is a multi-genre performance series we run right out of this space, and we host mainly Chicago artists doing a variety of work: music, comedy, storytelling, poetry, theater, the list goes on. So we're in our spring quarter right now. We will be announcing our summer quarter soon. Check out Steppenwolf's website and see what else we have going on. There's lots of fun stuff. This is a very exciting afternoon. You know, Sylvia Ewing has done so much for the Chicago cultural community over the years, and is just a real gift to all of us, as she always brings together the most amazing groups of people. And so we are really honored to be hosting her and her amazing guests and all of you today. So without further ado, let's talk with Sylvia Ewing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hey, everybody. I'm so glad that you're here. We played Everybody is a Star because everybody is. I love seeing all the generations here. I'll introduce my honored guests in just a minute. But I just want to tell you, I do have a history with Steppenwolf Theater. I was recruited after the success of a blues hip-hop show I did on radio. And I ended up being the first black person in the artistic office of Steppenwolf for a season. I left WBEZ to take a role here. And there were 4 of us who had a very specific thing in mind. Come in, sit down. I know y'all late. Come on. It's family. It's family. I'm not calling attention to you. Hi, Sarah. Hi, Mark. But it was Martha Levy, who was the artistic director of Steppenwolf, Tori Malatia, who a lot of people may know from his name being called out on This American Life. He was my boss at WBEZ, and a guy named David Hawkinson. And we wanted people to experience theater together. So I'm going to just ask, can you bring up the house lights a minute, Matt? Also, people coming in, just look around. You know, more folks will be coming, but see who you're sharing this experience with. Who's in the room really matters. Who you have a cultural experience with shifts what it means to experience it. So when theater was just all, no harm meant, older white folks, there was a certain feeling in the room. When you add younger people, when you add children, when you add diversity, it changes the experience in a very meaningful way. So I'm really glad to see you all here. And I think that's really all I wanted to say. I'm delighted to be back as a producer. You can bring the lights down. And I'm working with a producer who I knew when she was in kindergarten. So this is the circle of life, that beauty of sustainability of ages and working together across generations. So I'm just going to talk to my friends and ask them questions. I will say right now, so she doesn't yell at me later, hi, Layla, to my granddaughter. Okay, so then we will be quiet later on, and to your mom and dad. So let's give a round of applause before I even introduce them. We're also being filmed by Can TV. Thank you, Can TV, folks. So y'all going to be on TV. So I am just delighted to be talking with 2 people who I've known both of you for 15, 20 years. And the first is Masakwa Myers. She's an art administrator, film producer, actress, director, curator. Just an amazing woman, currently running the Southside Community Arts Center. She's here in the middle. Please give her a round of applause. And I will always say Rudy Lozano Jr. because I knew his father. He's the vice president of the Fellowship Initiative at Chase Bank and also does something with global philanthropy. He's an alum of Public Allies and Leadership Greater Chicago. Give him a round of applause, too. Might have a mom and a kid in the audience. That's how we like to roll. So, this is just sharing recipes for life and wisdom across generations. So, I'm going to start on the outer edge and just ask you, Rudy, how did you know that you wanted to make social change and that you wanted to be an activist?
I actually didn't. I think it was something I was expected to do, born into. My mother, who is here sitting there, um, took us everywhere and involved us in the beginning, electoral politics, and knocking on doors and canvassing and stuffing envelopes. So much of it in my early life was you had to do it. And so when I realized it, I think I was about around the time when we met, about 20, 21, 22. And it happened through an experience of working at Public Allies, or actually an AmeriCorps program, and having the opportunity to go and work inside of Farragut High School. And this is mid-90s. And it was the first time I saw what we call the school-to-prison pipeline up close. I had an opportunity to go to Whitney Young and went to magnet schools in CPS. And so we didn't experience police officers in the hallways and metal detectors at the entrance and question, every 20 feet you walk. And so when I had that experience at Farragut High School, that would have been my community high school, my neighborhood high school. It kind of upset me and made me understand why I had been involved all these years in my family, being exposed to issues of social justice and equity and everything. So that's when I realized.
Well, I appreciate that. And I had found a picture from 1999 when I did a piece for the Sun-Times. It was after Columbine. And after Columbine, there was a trend in journalism, because the pendulum swings and comes and goes, but to really demonize young people. And I wanted to talk about young people who were doing great work. And I interviewed you, canvassing or holding up a paper, telling people to do something, and you were 23. So I'm going to be honest and say it was 20 years ago. It was 1999. 20 years later, here we are. So people who brought young folks, one of the takeaways from today is to understand that what you do now matters and what young people do now matters. So coming back to you, when did you first know that you were going to be an activist or storyteller, involved in making change?
Well, actually, my response is similar to Rudy's. I believe when you grow up in a family that is active, focused with their children, trying to, of course, develop well-rounded citizens, that you fall into activism, if that's your lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that was my lifestyle. I had a mother and a father that were very sensitive and in tune to social injustices. And the time that I was coming up, a little earlier than Rudy, I was telling him earlier, I said, I'm sure you're my son's age.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's what we
actually,
want.
Yeah, I know. And so he's in between my two sons. And so it is just that starting with my parents and then being able to meet some really interesting people along the way. In high school, there was an instructor by the name of Phyllis Jenkins, who was a biology teacher. However, she was an activist as well. And to see her buck the system, so to speak, seeing her being one of those first people to wear her hair in a natural state, was very rebellious at the time. Mm-hmm. So I looked up to her. Then there were people like Val Gray Ward that I met at an early age that inspired me as well. Then we have people like Abena Joan Brown. These are people that were in my life after the foundation was laid by my parents. I understood how important it was early that you get involved if you want to see change. And so I was 10 years old when the Birmingham church bombing took place.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a 10-year-old girl that died in that church bombing. And I remember that being a very defining moment in my life. And I was saying that I need to do as much as I could to make sure, in my way, that her death wasn't in vain.
Well, and that's another thing that you share with Rudy, because he lost his father, who was a great human rights activist at an early age, also due to, external influences like that. But I'm going to come back to you with, we can come from cultures where people said young people are to be seen and not heard. And I came from a family where young people were seen and listened to. And I think you both did as well. What was it like to be empowered to have a voice at an early age? And what did that look like in your family, Masekwa?
Okay, well, I did come from that kind of a background where children should be seen and not heard. However, my mother was pretty progressive, so of course she came from that background, and she tried to balance it with her family. So we had a chance to express ourselves at the dinner table. I don't know if we have dinner tables anymore now, where all the family comes home and at least sit twice a week, Sunday for sure, and listen to one another. Well, I had that opportunity. I have two brothers. I'm in the middle. I'm a middle child, and yes, I'm pretty much a mediator. So it was just important for me at that time.
And you got to practice a little bit too.
Yeah, so what happens is there's still a cutoff. They're still your parents, so you just can't say anything and everything that you want to say, but you can at least express your opinion, mostly.
What about you, Rudy?
So interesting dynamic with my mother in the room and my daughter in the room.
Just ignore them. It's
Yeah.
just us.
Trying.
Just us.
Trying to let the brain relax a little. So I think it was a balance as well. I think we had the opportunity to go out into the world and express ourselves. At home, just depended on the issue. It just depended on what we're talking about.
Don't look over there. Don't look over there.
Couldn't help myself. And but I think for the most part, comparatively speaking, we had lots of democratically, open conversations and decision making at home.
That's very good. And I will say, my son is here. He scored very high on vocabulary and articulation, and his sister is all she does is talk. And with my mother, Eve Ewing and Matthew Ewing, and in my house, you could speak, but you better enunciate and you better have something to say. And then when my mom was tired, she'd say, "I'll just give you $1 if you don't talk for 5 minutes." Never got the dollar, and neither did Eve. And I think my granddaughter might never get that dollar either.
Yeah.
So how do you handle the emotional baggage that comes? Coming back to both of what you do, you have gone from that young person organizing young people to a very serious role making opportunities for young people. And Masekwa, I remember when I met you in Pomone, someone was giving you an award and asked me to moderate, and you guys had done so many things, and just like this quiet force, not just locally, but internationally. But what happens when you run into obstacles or you get disheartened? How do you recharge your batteries? And I'll start with you, Rudy.
So it's funny. I was having the same conversation with some recently close friends. I was at a convening about a week and a half ago, and it's all people of color educators. We spent a year together in a fellowship. And so in my mind, I was describing, I just feel like it's karma, right? Like the first half of my life was rough, and the second half has been so far the better half. She explained, no, that's not right. What it is you've learned from your experiences and you develop multiple coping mechanisms and strategies to counteract or be proactive in terms of whatever comes your way that could trigger any kind of past trauma or any kind of obstacles you're going to deal with now. So you've sort of tooled up, and I never thought about it that way. But I think that is the case. I think, as my family will attest, love to go on vacations. It's something my mother introduced to us. We would leave for a month every year and just drive wherever. And that became our coping mechanism for dealing with Chicago. And I think everybody knows what that means. So we'd get away. We'd drive to Texas. We'd go to Michigan. We'd go to Indiana. We'd drive throughout the Midwest. Florida, California. And so vacations for me are part of that coping mechanism now. I need to get away and unplug from everything that I know. I also am in a phase now where I'm not watching anything really intense, since I have to work with young people and families who are dealing with real life intense situations. So I try not to watch the news too much, although my mother would argue that started when I was about 13 or 14. And so I make sure I don't trigger myself. Or if I do, I know I'm ready to deal with it. So I'm just very aware of what my triggers are and how to manage those at this point.
I like that. And before I come to Masekwa, you had talked before about it can't just be Saul Alinsky, I'm angry. What about self-care and taking care of yourself?
So I'm also at a point in terms of the organizing and activism that I do is, if we're not a part of whatever movement we're building, then we're not building the right movement. So we have to include our families. We have to include our elderly, our children. And if it's not inclusive enough for us, then we're probably not doing the right work. And so I'm, having been a second generation activist family, I see now how important it is that I need to not only include my children, but if it's not right for my children, then maybe it's not right for our families at this time. And so, yeah, I think that's a big thing. I also think self-care and being able to know where your limits are and not sacrifice yourself. Don't be a martyr for the movement. The movement is protracted. It's long, and we have a lifetime to give to it. And as someone who grew up in that, I see the wear and tear it has on friends and family, and we have to be able to step aside and say, someone else is going to lead. It's okay. The movement will not fall apart if we step out for a second.
Very good. That's sustainability. What about you, Maseko? How do you rejuvenate?
Well, I will say this, that I don't really talk about myself well, especially in public, believe it or not. And I'm
just
sitting
us.
here.
It's
and
just
I'm sitting
us.
here talking to you in front of just us. So the question is, because Rudy talked a little while there.
Sorry.
It's empowerment. What?
Well, the
focus me.
Yeah, and the question really is, when you need to rejuvenate and find renewal, what does that? How do you do it? And I will, just as a reminder, you said something to me about control or things you can't control. If you could start with sharing that.
Well, I did share with you that one thing that keeps a person healthy, and that's mentally, emotionally, and physically, if they understand that you should not try to control things that you have no control over. And once you can recognize that, then that allows you to breathe. And so how I rejuvenate, I need to learn better how to rejuvenate. And it's getting better now that I'm over 60. I would have liked to have learned it maybe at 25.
That's why we're here.
Or 30. But when you're passionate about something, you do have a tendency not to pace yourself. Well, I had a tendency not to pace myself. Let me speak for myself. And what I learned was to do for yourself as you teach others. A lot of times we don't do that. So to rejuvenate means to retract a little bit, be around people that you know are sincere and love you, to rejuvenate. Also, breathe. Take your time to take a moment, because it is proven scientifically that deep breathing changes the physiological tension that one feels.
That's true.
When they're in a very tight situation. So some practical things that I learned over the years in my theatrical knowledge and background, how to relax.
That's beautiful. Give them some applause for getting us this far. This is Let's Talk with Sylvia Ewing. We're looking at recipes for life and ingredients or wisdom for generations. I'm Sylvia, and I'm speaking with Rudy Lozano Jr. and Ms. Masakwa Myers. We have just a few more questions, and then we have an intermission. You guys can breathe. You had the stress getting here. I'm so glad that you're here. But along the same lines, what about the sources of your faith and power? And I'll start with you. Like, what is that source for you?
Well, okay, let's talk about religion and spirituality now. I was raised a Christian, Protestant to be more specific. And I often say that if I had been raised Baptist, I might still be in the church because of all that energy that comes out of that church for me. I remember as a young person, about 12 years of age, and I was going to church on the bus with my younger brother, which is something my mother hardly ever did, but we were growing up and she was allowing us to be independent. And on the way to church, I could hear this music coming out of this building. It didn't look like a church. Now I know what they were called, storefront churches. But it sounded so exciting. So I detoured with my younger brother, and we went into that church. I later found out that it was what people call a sanctified church. And so they had the tamarines going and the guitar going, the trap drums going. I'm going, yes, I like this. But I said, let me get out of here and go to our church and all of that. Well, let me just say this, that I obviously was not fulfilled spiritually in the church that my family introduced me to. So around the age of around 14, 15, I started doing my own research and reading about different religions. And what I found out was that in the heart of all the religions that I studied, everyone came together on how you're supposed to treat someone. So if you treat someone with high morals, like you don't kill, you don't steal, you don't try to tear someone down, then we're all similar in that way of expressing how you treat someone in spirituality. So what I have learned is that it's all about, for me, having faith in a higher power that has created life. But I don't have to label it. I don't have to say I belong to a certain sect. And as a result of that, I get a chance to worship with everybody.
That's beautiful. Very beautiful. Rudy, what about you?
So I...
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No.
I'm going to touch you. I need to say this, that
Please.
what I did learn was that I went way back before Christianity was even introduced to the world. And what I have concentrated on more than anything is a West African religion that is Yoruba out of Nigeria, West Africa. So that's where I've settled right now.
After studying all of them. Very good. Thanks for sharing that. Rudy?
So I started in, I believe, a household that there wasn't very much religion, organized religion. And then along the way, my grandmother and my mother came up with an agreement. And so I went through the Catholic Church, communion, confirmation, all those things. But I, too, didn't find the spirituality there. I found community, which was wonderful. I think the community that I was a part of already growing up in a very politically active family, surrounded by people who were building movement, that became church for me personally. That became the place where I found spiritual grounding, where I found my trust in humanity, having it challenged when I was 7 and having my father assassinated at that age was, religion was just not something. And as I got older and learned the history of, in particular, the church in the Americas, I was not a big fan at all. And so for me, the grounding became with people and building connections with people. And so my church is still surrounding myself with people who are trying to build. Frankly, I'm kind of personally done with trying to destroy things, even out of anger.
You can clap for that.
Well, we heard this.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, and there's much need still to dismantle the systems we live under. But I also see that we need to build the future that we want. And so I'm about that now. I'm very much concentrated in that. And of course, I've learned how to fight from some of the best in the city, so I know how to defend myself. But I think in terms of building the future we want to see, I'm spending my energy doing that nowadays. And that, if you will, is restoring my faith in people and humanity, etc.
That's very good. So this is a hard question, but you are great folks. What do you think the biggest problem is that's facing Chicago? We have, I know, we have, new folks here. This is about you and not the world, but I do want to just broaden it a second and get a sense from you about what you think that is. And I'll cheat a little bit and start first and just say lack of faith in regular people is my view, because just regular folks can do amazing things, and we often default to this leader or that leader, or just don't believe that someone who doesn't have a doctorate or might be blue collar or came from another country. So that's just what I'll say.
Interesting.
As way of a prompt. But what do you guys think?
I would venture to say kindly that a ignorance or a misunderstanding due to underexposure to people is our biggest problem. I could have just said racism. But I decided to say it that way.
Okay.
Because it was a little more encompassing.
Sure.
And in this country for sure, in Chicago for sure, we need to have the hard conversations about the truth of the building of this country. And we need to talk about the transatlantic slave trade. We have to do this, and we have to understand that it's not about integration, even though integration is okay if it's in its proper form. It's about respect. I don't have to live in a community that has a Latino on the left side, an Asian on the right side, and a white person on the next side for it to be good. I just need to be able to walk through any community and not be disrespected. So that's kind of simplistic and broad,
But
that's my
appreciate it.
response.
Yeah, that's in the time we have, that's good. Rudy?
Completely agree. I think it has to do with inequity and access. And having been raised in a very internationalist, Marxist lensed family, my wife can attest to this. In the past year, I've been on this hard racial equity tip, really. And so, for me, in the city of Chicago, it's about, our young people being criminalized. It's about whole communities being criminalized and divested in. And so where's the access? Where are the resources? And of course, there's a class analysis there as well. But for me, it's about racism right now. It's about equity, and let's see what the new mayor has to say about that, and this new city council coming in. And I think the changing of the old structure of a Chicago machine is crumbling, but the foundations are still there, right? The real estate conglomerates, the corporate entities in the city are still controlling a lot of the decisions being made in the city. And so I think we have an opportunity to change that. The faces of the city council have changed. Let's hope that the vision also changes as well.
A lot of audience agreement out there. So, two last questions. The first one, what do you love the most about your life here and now? Like, what are you loving? Like now. I'm loving your pink, but I mean deeper than that.
That's funny.
Fuchsia.
Fuchsia.
But what are you loving?
Am I going first?
Yes.
Okay.
So what am I loving right now? I think I'm really loving on just where I'm at in life. I feel like I've been on a journey of healing for quite some time, and I'm loving where I'm sort of landing, if you will, for the time being. And when I said these vacations, they're not always this luxurious. I don't want people to think we're on luxurious vacations all the time. Sometimes they're weekend getaways, but they're an opportunity to unplug. But the fact that actually this week we're going to be taking a trip to see family in Texas. And so I really appreciate the fact that we're at a point where we can just get away and unplug a little and see some family we haven't seen in a while. And I truly enjoy when we get to take my mother along as well. And she doesn't always agree to join us, but I'm truly enjoying that, and I'm enjoying that laughter in the background as well.
Yeah, I'm not going to look because I might know who it is. But... And what about you?
At this point in time, I'm just loving being here. Yes, I have over a half of a century of being able to look back and feel really good about what I've accomplished, the fact that I have a loving family, the fact that I have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and the fact that I'm healthy enough. So it doesn't take a lot for me to love my life, because I understand, as far as I'm concerned, the essence of life is to be a good person, to be able to help and care when needed, not to hurt people, not to be negative for the sake of being negative. So I had a daughter-in-law. She's an ex-daughter-in-law now. Still love her, and we're fine. But she would walk around, or I shouldn't say walk around like she did all the time, but she did possess and own a T-shirt that said, "High maintenance." So I said, okay. Looked at my son and said, "You do see that, don't you?" Now, it's nothing wrong with high maintenance. But if it becomes the wherewithal, then we might have a problem, right? Because to me, high maintenance is more about materialism as opposed to personal development. That's my answer.
I love it.
I'll add one thing too.
Sure.
Just seeing the sun come out more consistently in Chicago and things turn green again
Yeah.
That would be
gonna love that.
Yeah, we're under
Just
the
the
white
beginning.
sky a lot. To see the blue sky is good. Well, this is part of what this time together is supposed to bring to people. Wisdom, people who are evolving. We're all trying to evolve. We can't be our best selves every day, but we can strive to be a little better today than we were yesterday, and to be self-aware. So I'm just so delighted to have these recipes from your lives as wisdom to share. But one last thing before we go to our intermission. What's your biggest lesson that you'd like to pass on?
That's interesting. When you're asked a question and you want a spontaneous answer, it
Takes a
becomes
second.
difficult, right? Because you don't want to miss anything. So there's so many lessons that one learns in a lifetime. And the biggest lesson is hard to identify. I guess I will say the biggest lesson, and it won't be the biggest lesson.
For this moment in time.
It will be, right? Is that it was a lesson I learned from Dr. Margaret Burroughs. Dr. Margaret Burroughs, as we know, as some of us know, is the co-founder of the DuSable Museum of African American History. She's also one of the early artists and founders of the Southside Community Arts Center. She's an author. She was an author, a poet, a painter, a commissioner for years, and a professor, I think, if I didn't say that. And what she did for me in my younger years, late teens, early 20s, was to show me that you don't have to hate anyone else to love yourself. Matter of fact, once you understand your true self and you love yourself, it's easier to love everyone else. So the biggest lesson maybe that I learned in my lifetime was to just stand for truth as you know it and to be the best person that you can possibly be at all times. I left my staff yesterday, and there were two young women, two millennials that I left in charge. And so I always like to say a little life lesson to people that I work with, especially if they're younger. And I told them, I said, okay, I'm counting on you all. And what I want you to know from me today is be strong when you have to, but be kind as often as you can.
Love it. How about some applause for that one? Rudy?
I don't know what else I can add. I'd say some of the things that I have seen as major lessons is to lead your life with your heart and with love, and approach people with that spirit. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, the next minute, the next day. And I think every point of contact with someone, we want to both absorb and share as much positivity, create as much unity, love as we can, because we don't know if that could be the last time we see them. And so I try to be that example, not only for my children, but I try to live that example because we just don't know. And so for me, it's also about, what are we doing to build a place where everyone will be respected and treated with what they need, not necessarily equality, but equity, right? And so how do we also teach one another and show one another that we can all grow together without being negative or putting someone else down, although there are some folks who need to share a little bit more, and so we do need to recalibrate how resources are distributed on this planet, but I think we can still do that from a point of love.
Thank you. Give them a round of applause, please. Rudy Lozano Jr., Vice President of the Fellowship Initiative at J.P. Morgan Chase, longtime activist from a family making change, and I love to call her Madame Masakwa Myers, who is the Executive Director of the Southside Community Arts Center and has forgotten more about change and justice in the arts than many people have ever thought about. So thank you so much. We're going to have a little intermission. I'm going to let these guys go, and we'll come back in at 10 minutes and talk with Rita Colburn and Lolly Bowen. So thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm so glad that you're here. I really can't see you, but I know that you are there. And hopefully enjoying who you're sitting next to and experiencing this differently because of that. So I have Amazing Guests Part 2. And they are on the far side, Lolly Bowen, a reporter with the Chicago Tribune, a member of the National Association of Black Journalists, and she was a 2017 Neiman Fellow at Harvard and is a Studs Terkel Award winner. Please give it up for Lolly Bowen. She looks particularly fabulous today. And then Rita Colburn, who is absolutely amazing. And it's not an error, but an update. It's Colburn, simplifying the name. She brought the documentary Maya Angelou and Still I Rise to life. She's a co-producer, and it premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. She's an Emmy and Peabody Award winner, which is really big in the field, just like the Neiman is. She's known for her diverse work in print, television, radio, and film with Oprah Winfrey and Harpo, C-SPAN, PBS, BET, and more. So give it up for Rita Colburn. I'm Sylvia. This is Let's Talk with Sylvia Ewing, and we are sharing recipes for life and wisdom for generations. And I'm going to just start right with both of you in terms of what made you choose storytelling. And Lolly, I'll come to that end. You were a storyteller from an early age. What made you choose that?
Well, storytelling and writing was very natural for me. It was really instinctive. I always loved writing and journaling, and I knew early on, even before I was a teenager, around 12, that I wanted to be a writer. I didn't know how I could make money from writing, however. But when I was about 12 or maybe 13 years old, I met another Black journalist who worked at the local paper. Her name was Jackie Brown, and this was in Knoxville, Tennessee. And so when she learned that I had ambition to be a journalist, she kind of took me under her wing. Well, not kind of, she absolutely took me under her wing, helped me get an internship at the local paper, and it was through her that I learned my craft from A to Z. So it was essentially mentoring that led me toward the path of being a journalist.
I like that. You learned how to make some money, too.
Yes.
Kinda.
Good. A little bit of money.
Very good, very good. And Rita, what about you?
Okay. Now, I'm also going to say that because Lolly is with the Tribune, that you need to read her articles.
That's
They're
right.
absolutely wonderful, and people can now count how many readers there are. And if you want our community represented, you need to keep reading and tell everybody else to
Oh,
read.
goodness.
That's
Thank you for
right.
that
There you
plug.
go.
I love that. I love it.
Yeah.
So what about you? How did you start?
Well, because of the context of my life. So I was born in 1958. And to put that in context, there was no integration in our school system in the south suburbs of Chicago until after 1968. So in my small town, 4 blocks by 9, we had chickens on the block. There were only 2 white people, 2 white women that were married to Black men. And then this was a Black community. Well, when I got to school, I didn't see any of the people in the books that we were taught from, and I didn't hear anything about who we were. But all of these people, there was Miss Wilson, who did some odd things, but there was Miss Wilson. There was my mother and my father and all the stories of our neighborhood. And so as I began to read voraciously, everything from Pippi Longstocking to Encyclopedia Brown and what I could get my hands on, I still didn't see us in the way that I felt I needed to. And so I too began to write, and I wanted to tell our stories. And I felt that our stories had to be told, because if our stories were missing, then there were a lot of other people's stories that were missing. So I found myself reading as writers do, and then over time, looking at journalism and saying, the facts are there, but I don't see my people. How do I see me in these things? And so that led to documentaries and different forms of content.
And with your family life, it'll give you a chance to talk a little more about your youth, but you were empowered to speak. We got clarification in our first act because I said you came from families where children were seen and listened to. So maybe there was a little seen and heard too. But in your family, what was it like at the table? Were you empowered to speak and encouraged to speak?
I was encouraged to speak, and I was encouraged to have a very vivid imagination. And so I didn't quite fit later on with journalism, because if I didn't know something, I just made it up. So as a result of that, I ended up needing more fiction and landing there. They tried to put me on the little news thing in grade school, and they said, "Where are you getting those facts from?" And I'm like, "Well, I figured it should," and they said, "No." But I had teachers who said, "She needs to write," and I began to write. And as I began to write and I began to speak in my family, my sister and I would put on plays so that our father would give us a quarter or whatever. And so we just learned to tell stories. And I found the stories of older Black women in particular so amazing. And the fact that everybody didn't know these stories. When you're a child, you think everybody knows everything you do. You think everything that goes on in your house goes on in every other house. And so I was able to speak, but I was also able to find out that that wasn't true. And so that empowered me to want to tell. And
Very
that was
good.
it.
Thank you. And what about you, Lottie? Because you got a job and you were telling early.
Yes. So I would say in my household, children were encouraged to be seen and to listen. And so at home, I definitely learned how to fine-tune my oral skills, AURAL, learning how to listen to people and listen in between the lines and really hear. And that helped me as a writer. So writing became a way that I could express myself and express what I've heard and what I'd heard from my community. And much like Miss Rita, when I started, I noticed that there had not been a lot of stories told about the community that I lived in. I lived in a segregated neighborhood. It was all Black, and this was in the 80s and 90s. So just like Chicago, a lot has not changed. So I got to see, watch, listen, and understand the complex stories of our community and then translate that into writing. So although I wasn't heard at home, I was definitely read at home.
Very good. Thank you. How do you handle emotional baggage that comes from seeing some of the problems in the world? You worked for Harpo Radio and television. You've done a lot of work, did a documentary on Miss Massaquoi locally, nationally. You covered Katrina as part of your beat and a number of other really telling issues. How do you renew when you see challenge?
I think there's a number of things. Covering Katrina specifically was extremely emotionally devastating. I had lived in New Orleans for about 5 years, and so to return a few months after moving to Chicago and see that type of devastation was it was heavy emotionally to carry. But one of the things that I remind myself as a journalist is to kind of center myself where I'm at this moment. And so although I'm telling the stories of other people and I am sometimes embedded in their tragedy, that is their story. It is not my own story. I'm on dry ground. I'm, able to work and to elevate people by telling their stories, but their tragedy is not necessarily my tragedy. I also find some strength in just knowing that by translating their stories to a broader audience and elevating their stories, that it can sometimes bring immediate relief, but it also records them into the history and into the fabric of our overall communities. So they're not being forgotten. Their stories are being told, recorded, and recorded as a part of history.
That's beautiful. That's the work. Yep. The work can lift you up. What about you, Rita?
I think that we probably are similar spirits, and when you find what you're supposed to be doing, I believe that I'm a griot. I believe that I'm that person that's set by the gate and told what happened 64 reigns ago when this happened and so on. That person today would have a camera, would have social media, and so on. And so I believe that it is my blessing to be able to tell. And so when I see things that are tragic, I am reminded that they happen to one person at a time. So that we need to always be kind because you don't know what happened to a person. And so I live in a place of kindness, and then I'm kind to myself. And so when I see this, I'm going to tell, but I'm going to give myself time to adjust to something. And I'm always going to look for it because I want to know. And I know what my job is. And so I've gotten to a peace with that. Now, some of that comes with age, and there's times when you just feel like you've really got to run out there and slay the dragons. But what you find is you find a strategy to do that, and then it allows you to come to it from a more, a calmer place and a more effective place.
That's really something I want to let the audience sit with, because it is a reminder as we go about every day, knowing what's happening in this moment. We're often thinking about the past or the future. Right now is a gift. That's why they call it the present. I know it's cheesy, but it comes back to what you said about covering Katrina and your work. Sitting with this moment is really important. But along all of these lines, talk about your source of faith and power.
Okay. So is this the one, as Maseko said, is this one about religion?
What it is to you.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Or spirituality is what I would say.
Okay. So for me, it's faith. I was raised Christian. I was raised by not just my mother and father, but I had an aunt. And we were so close, I call her Mama Maymay. And we would sit together, and she would tell me, so-and-so left the earth. And a couple of hours later, past Bonanza, whatever we were watching, you would get a phone call. And so I asked her, how did she do that? And she said, when we picked cotton and when we were in the fields, we had to feel, because we didn't have telephones, and we had to know when to run, when to go, get in touch with your spirit. So for me, I pray, I read, I've taught the Bible in my home to various groups of people. I'm traditional in that sense. The same religion that my aunt taught me and that my grandfather, who was a slave until he was 8 years old, used is fine with me. I'm just learning more and more about it, and so my sense is my power comes from knowing that God created me. And if you go within the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The first thing that I am in the image of God is a creator. I take nothing and make something wonderful out of it. And so I live in that space, so that's my faith.
That's beautiful. Thank you. We can apply that. Lolly?
Well, similarly, I was raised in a Christian household. I was raised in the Baptist church. I do consider myself a church girl. You may see me doing some unchurched behavior, but
It's just us.
I'm not
Most of
perfect.
us.
I'm a human. But having the experience, particularly in the Black church, allows for a certain amount of space for emotional expression. And so I still am a girl who goes to church on Sundays, who still shouts, who still responds to the music. And so that gives me one emotional outlet. But I'm also a person who believes in prayer and meditation. And it's interesting because even as I've wrestled with my faith and wrestled with certain personal traumas that have happened to me that have led me into the desert of faith is what I'll say. Even in those moments, I have found that prayer just allows you to reevaluate your circumstances. It allows you to center yourself. And so it's similar to meditation, where you just take a moment to be quiet, to breathe, to think over your situation and kind of reframe it. And so I've always leaned on prayer, even when I'm not in and out of the church, or even when I'm not exhibiting church behavior.
Well, I just want to say you've answered a question you asked me earlier, like how'd you know who you wanted to talk to? You know, that is a spiritual or an intuitive thing. People who need to be seen, people who are brilliant, and some folks may know, others may not. But to quote Biggie Smalls, if you don't know, now you know. But that's one of the reasons that I wanted to have you, because you see this similarity. And I also love how you're able to say, I was born in 1958. If we don't acknowledge what it looks like to have been born in 1957 or 1958, we're not setting an example for people to know what that life is like, and to say, oh, that can be me. I can talk and think and not have to be put aside at a certain age. But it's not about me. Let's keep it rolling, as I like to say. What do you think is the biggest problem facing Chicago, or how would you characterize that? You were watching in the green room, so you have the benefit that others didn't have. But what do you think is the biggest problem?
Racism.
That was easy.
And I think that what has happened is the biggest problem in this country, and what James Baldwin calls these yet to be United States. If we do not understand that bias puts black people in particular and brown people in a situation of post-traumatic stress daily, then we are not acknowledging what we need to do in order to, we say violence, but when you have years and decades and going on centuries of no opportunity, I like to see what you would do. And so the issues that we have, there's a movement to work with bias, and we can call it whatever we want to call it. But as long as you can define me by the jersey of skin that I wear, and because of our colors, I'm the skin blood evidence that there was no such thing as consensual sex in America. That's why we look like we look. We are your cousins, but you don't want to acknowledge us. And that means we should have the same thing that you have. When we get pregnant, we should have care. When we go for jobs, we should have opportunity. And until you head on deal with that, we're not, and laws are changing, because we're putting, you've got 131 women in Congress, woo woo. You know, you have 17 black legislators, and they're going to change things, but we need to give a hand. And it's hard when you have to give up some of the lakefront property, but you need to understand nobody owns the lake.
Thank you. Lolly?
I would absolutely agree. I think I would phrase it a little differently. I mean, it's still racism, but I would say the blatant inequity that continues to exist in this city, and the comfort level of our white and middle-class counterparts, that they are okay watching, seeing, and knowing that this disparity exists. So to come to the South Side or come to the West Side and see that your neighbors, one, to have to come there in order to see your brown-skinned neighbors is telling all in of itself, right? That there's a still blatant segregation. To look around your own neighborhoods and see that you are harboring the majority of the wealth and the majority of the resources, I constantly think, how do you live with that? How do you justify that? How do you justify seeing black and brown children on the South and West Sides not have adequate schools to go to, or not have community centers, or not have resources, or to be over-policed? How can you be comfortable with that inequity?
All right. And what do you love most about your life here and now? What do you love?
Oh, goodness. I didn't know that question was going to come from me first.
Bam.
Right now, I think what I love the most is that I finally feel that I'm settling into some self-acceptance. And it took a long time to get to that point. Yesterday, I was out on my bike on the lakefront, and I was moving so slow. And I told myself that that's okay because I'm moving, right? I had to remind myself that it's not about moving as fast as everybody else, that we all have our own pace. And sometimes, particularly as we age, that pace changes. So I'm learning to accept where I'm at and accept that this is where I belong at this moment.
I love it. Thank you. Rita?
I love a lot right now, and I think that's a function of aging. And I also am so happy to hear you have it now. I think that that's really important, and as close as we can get to loving ourselves, which is what that is about. There's always going to be something that we want to improve, something that we're going to change. And so when you go with riding your bike, one of my golf partners is here, and I will say, I played so poorly yesterday, I had to talk to myself. I had to say to myself, one day when people look at you, you won't be just chunking it down. You'll actually get it. Let's get back in the cart and do it again. And I just talked to myself, and because I was by myself, so it was a good conversation. And whenever I play with myself, I always win. And so I like that. But what I like now is that that puts me outside in the air, in the elements. And I like the fact that I'm accepting everything that is coming to me. And I think I want to see people get there sooner and sooner. And this is good. We work hard, so we should have that element of just enjoying our lives and enjoying the people around us.
That's beautiful. Applause for that, too. I see somebody taking notes. That always makes me feel good. I have to say that I was talking with somebody about health in the swim aqua aerobics, which is the great place to go when you're getting it together because you're working out, but you're in the water. There's nothing more low impact. And a woman older than me said that she wished she had known then what she knows now, and that she had taken things seriously about her medicine, about her health. And hearing you say, learn it, but learn it sooner. That's part of why we're here together, to learn from each other and learn it sooner. You're still going to do what you want to do. I think my friend Rachel brought her daughters here. They're still going to do what they want to do. 11, 12. You're going to do what you want to do, but we can try to help you make it a little easier than we had it. And then there are some things it's just your destiny to learn on your own, and then we'll learn from you. So with that said, what's the biggest lesson you've learned? And you can take your time. I know somebody talked to me about authenticity. I think it was you.
Yeah.
I almost said it was other people, so I would love to hear more about that. But what's the biggest lesson for me? It's that you can learn through joy. We hear about the slings and arrows, the hard knocks. This happened. A hard head makes a soft butt is something my grandma used to say.
Yeah,
she didn't
that's
say
right.
butt.
She said soft behind,
Yeah.
or maybe she didn't.
Right, or maybe she didn't. But knowing that you can learn through joy, that you can learn through stuff that makes you incredibly happy, that is great, as much as you can learn from all the horrible stuff, that was a huge lesson for me. So what about you guys? What's your biggest lesson?
I think my lesson is kind of twofold. One, treat people like gold. It's a reflection of you, not of them. So no matter what people do or how they behave, remember to treat them like gold. And that's because this life has an expiration date that we don't know. And so since we don't know the expiration date, take risks and live life fully.
I love that. Thank you.
I think the authenticity is another way of saying to be very truthful. to yourself and to other people, and to have authentic relationships. Now, on the outset, that seems easy, but I know people who have been living with people in their homes for 30 years and they don't really know each other. They don't know themselves. It's really important to have a truthful encounter, because from that you can gain something. So if I'm truthful with a person that I meet, that time we spent together meant something. I saw them, they saw me. We all want to be as known as we can be by someone, especially by the people we love. And so I think that you need to be truthful in order to get to that space, and you have to fight for that, because sometimes you don't have your voice, sometimes you don't know who you are, but you need to make that fight to become as authentic as you can as soon as possible.
Wow, thank you. So I'm gonna stand over here. I think the light works, and the mic, other Matt can make it work. Give them an applause, please. And I just wanted to wrap up with one thought. It's not super long, but it speaks to what we've been saying. In a youth-oriented and Western culture, I am pleased to say I'm 62 for the record, and to say that means something. And I wrote a piece for Yoga Chicago in 2015, and I said this: do you remember what it was like to be a child, impatient for adulthood? Have you experienced what it's like to have more years behind you than ahead of you in this life? I had some college students at the time who were in their early 20s, and they already felt like they were behind in the race for life. Conversely, I knew many older folks who were holding so firmly to the elixir of youth that they're missing the rich wine of maturity. The key to a joyful and healthy life is to embrace where we are in this moment, at this time, in step with the natural rhythms of life and with nature, which we've got to check out because we're jacking it up, and to share our experiences and knowledge across generations. So I want to bring the lights up so you can see who you're sharing with. And I thank you so very much for coming to Let's Talk with Sylvia Ewing, with Rita and Lolly, with Masekwa, and with Rudy. Thank you so much.